Bill McDonough, welcome to Australian Musician.
Thank you very much, Greg.
We're talking to you about your book, Sons of Beaches, which tells the story of Australian crawl, but not only that, the story of yourself and your brother, Guy. When did you start thinking about writing this book?
Well, it actually started about 10 years ago. I'd go on holidays with some friends of ours who were school teachers. And of an evening, we'd gather around the dining room table and I'd tell anecdotes over a glass of wine or 20. And they were so fascinated about some of the travel adventures of Guy and I, and then some of the crawl stories, that one of the ladies there said, "Bill, you've got to write these down." So that's exactly what I did. I started just writing a series of short stories. And after I had about, say, 6 chapters, if you want to call them that, I thought to myself, well, I've got the basis of a book and I will move forward on that basis.
Okay. Have you read many other music biographies? Did you have a template to follow?
No, I just did this myself. I've got a very good memory and I can remember the past well. Guy and I lived a very unusual life, an extraordinary life. It wasn't your normal, everyday suburban life. And I just wanted to get that down because it was so unique.
Yeah. It's certainly the tale of how Australian crawl begun, but I think more so it is the story of brotherhood, a nod to your brother. Would that be a fair comment?
Oh, absolutely. And that was paramount in the strategy of writing the book. I didn't want to write an Australian crawl book. That's not me. I'm going to leave that up to someone else. There's plenty of other really good rock and roll authors out there, and they'll probably tackle that in the future. But what I wanted to write was this story of the two brothers, of which Australian crawl was only just one part of.
Yeah. You weren't particularly interested in being a drummer, were you? In the beginning, you wanted to be a guitarist?
Oh, well, I suppose that came retrospectively, because then I realised that, being a drummer, you don't get the limelight that you do if you're a guitar player or a singer. You don't get the girls, you're stuck in the back line on the kit, and the girls pass by and go for Brad or Guy or James,
Yeah. So when you did start playing drums and you appreciated drumming, who were your drum heroes?
Well, as I say in the book, I was very enamoured with Ginger Baker and Mitch Mitchell and, of course, Keith Moon, those really, really amazing drummers, John Bonham. But when I realised how good they were, trying to emulate them with my abilities was not going to happen. So I sort of came back a notch and I started to play along with, the likes of Ringo Starr and Charlie Watts from the Stones. And I've based my style very much so on that very simple 4-on-the-floor basic rock beat.
Yeah. Did you ever get to meet any of your drum heroes?
No, I didn't. I've met a few rock stars in the day. And again, I mentioned a few in the book, even though I didn't want to make it a name-dropping exercise. But, we met some really huge stars. But no, I didn't actually meet Ginger Baker or Mitch Mitchell, or, of course, John Bonham died.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what was the kit that you played for most of the career?
Oh, well, the kit that I did my first records with, which were the records I did with Loose Trousers, and then the Australian Crawl Boys Light Up album, is my favourite kit, which I still have, and that's a Ludwig kit with a single-mounted tom. And I've got an amazing collection of cymbals, both for live and for recording, and I've still got all that together. But then after the Boys Light Up was so successful and we went to #1 and sold, all these records, I was sponsored by Billy Hyde Drum Clinic and a couple of their manufacturers. I played Tama drums, and I also then played Pearl drums. But I've still got my Ringo Starr Sparkly Ludwig kit. It's a ripper.
Yeah. Do you still get behind it?
No, not really, no. And the reason being is that I'm a really busy guy, and I don't have, because of my business interests outside of, my music career, I'm a very busy guy, and I don't really have time. But I did get back into the studio just before COVID, and I'm working with a guy called Peter Blyton, who was a record producer. He did Run to Paradise for Choir Boys. I think he worked with Michael Hutchins and a few other people like that, Radiators. He's a bass player, a producer, an arranger. And we got into the studio with a great guitarist, an unknown, a guy called Tony Lopez. And we were going to do a 4-track digital EP and release it, on the internet through iTunes. We got 1 track in, and then COVID hit. Right. And I've got that recording, and I was going to release that recording with the book, but then my record company decided to release, do like a re-release of our first greatest hits album, which was called Crawfile. So that came out at the same time as my book. So I just didn't release anything personally. But and on that recording, I do it all on computer. But being a real drummer, being a drummer, when I program drums, you can't tell the difference as to whether it's a drummer playing or a machine playing, because I write it as I would play it. And we even go to the point where we take the perfection out of it, and we actually program in, an element of imperfection.
Okay.
So it sounds real.
Yeah. So we can look forward to hearing that at some point?
Yes, I'll get it out at some stage. Yeah. It's just the 1 track.
Yeah. Australian Musician magazine was started by myself and a chap named Rob Walker. Yeah. Who you knew a long time ago. And in fact, Rob was in an early version of Australian Crawl, Spiff Rouch.
Yes.
How did you get to know Rob?
Well, Rob came on board as bass player for Spiff Rouch, and he was actually a friend of my now wife. They went to school together, and I'd been playing with guys in Frankston in relation to bands I'd been in at school. So I knew Bob was floating around, as a muso in the Frankston Mount Eliza sort of zone we lived in. I think actually the first guitar player for Spiff Rouch was a guy called Tim McDonald, and he suggested Rob. And so Rob became the bass player, and then Simon Binks replaced Tim McDonald. So we had, but before that, we had James and Guy and I forming Spiff Rouch, Bob on bass, and then Simon came in on guitar. And then we got a manager. I tell this story briefly in the book. We got a manager because we were on the cusp of really breaking through with Spiff Rouch. We were working 4 nights a week, doing the Melbourne club pub scene. We were getting a little bit of interest from management and record companies. And our manager at the time told Bob, "You got to quit your job, Bob, and go full time." And Bob was really reticent to do that. So he decided to go, and that's when Paul Williams, the bass player in Australian Crawl, came in. But he only played about 3 gigs, and then it was all over, because James and Simon were probably a little bit immature, and they just didn't feel like it was their time to become full-time rock and rollers. I think they wanted to go off and do a little bit more traveling like Guy and I'd done.
Yeah. Speaking of traveling, before you got into Australian Crawl, You had some adventures at sea with your brother. The sailing trips were quite an adventure, and I don't know that anyone can get themselves into those situations anymore these days. I guess there's still some dodgy people out there on the seas, but you really have fond memories of those days.
Well, yeah, that were the good old days, you know, when you and I were young, back in the 60s and 70s, and the world was a different place. You could still get lost if you went out into the big wide world. There were places where you could land and you could literally just get lost in, you know, Neverland, Nowheresville. Things just weren't as pacey and as populous as they are now, and as troubled as they are now. And that was a classic case of flying to Bali to start off an overland trek to Europe, do some surfing, but then we ended up becoming crew on this 52-foot ketch called the Baroness out of Benoa Harbour. And the aim of that journey was to sail across the Indian Ocean and then up the east coast of Africa, through the Suez Canal and to Europe that way. So we dropped our plan to go the hippie trail, you know, through Pakistan and Afghanistan and all that, and took on this boat trip. But it ended badly. I got monumentally seasick. And we ended up getting marooned on Christmas Island, which is now the detention centre. Didn't have a detention centre in those days. It was a phosphate mine. And we ended up being accommodated in the jail there and then deported back to Singapore. So it was quite an unusual adventure.
Yeah. Back in the day, you also got to see David Bowie's Ziggy Stardust show at the Rainbow in London. What do you remember about that gig?
His wild outfit and the face paint. Actually, that was in a previous trip. It wasn't on the trip that Guy and I did to Europe in 75. It was when I was sent over by a family business to do some training, some textile training, with a view of me, you know, going into the family business, which never happened because I went the other route. I went, you know, into the music rather into the family business. Took the risk and turned right instead of turning left. And but yeah, I just remember him. He was in that Ziggy Stardust stage with the red hair, you know, the androgynous look, the face paint. And it was at the Rainbow Theatre, the famous Rainbow Theatre, where like superstars had played, like Hendrix and, you know, it was a bit like the Fillmore, one of those theatres. Quite amazing. I've still got the ticket, you know. I had a little sort of paper ticket and I've still got it in my paraphernalia, my memorabilia.
Yeah.
I was 19 at the time. Yeah.
I think it's probably worth a bit of money now.
Probably would be. Yeah. I was amazed. It was moments like that that made me drift away from being responsible and going into the family business and really following my heart, as risky as it could be.
Yeah. You had your ups and downs with Australian Crawl, but what are your fondest memories of your time with the band?
Oh, I think making the records were great. I really enjoyed making the records, even though there was a lot of pressure. I did enjoy the band camaraderie in the early days before it soured. Certain members in the band became big-headed, egotistical, controlling, and wanted to take over the band. And that's when it lost it from my point of view. It became a struggle because I'm a team player. You know, I don't like dictators or dictatorships. I won't be told what's got to be done. You know, I'm old-fashioned. I'm one of the musketeers, you know, all for one and one for all. As corny as it might sound, that's the strength of a band. And when you've got people trying to control you and control the band, then that's when it soured. But prior to that, it was quite fun. It was really good. And I didn't mind touring, actually. Touring got a bit tiring, when you had to do 16 weeks straight. That would get tiresome. But I used to like going on the road with the guys because we had a very similar sense of humour, and we'd take the piss out of things. We're very sarcastic because I used to write comedy before I wrote music, songs.
Okay.
And yeah, I wrote for the ABC. I did a couple of like university reviews, and I wrote a couple of sketches for Paul Hogan as well. Okay. So I had that comedy side and that very sort of comedic personality, and I like to joke a lot with the guys. Take the piss.
As you said earlier, you did meet some pretty big rock stars. The meeting with Neil Young was quite unexpected, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, we were just at our digs, which was this beautiful, magnificent beach house right on the beach at Pounders Beach, which is on the north shore of Oahu. And it's close to the famous, surf spots like Pipeline and Sunset, where all the big surf competitions are held. And it used to belong to a wealthy American family during the war years. It was their sort of Hawaiian holiday house. And the studio was just down the road at the next little town. And all the guys in the band, it was a Saturday. We didn't work Saturdays or Sundays. All the guys had gone into into Honolulu to do some partying. And Guy and I, for some reason, stayed back. And we were just mucking around on the front lawn, overlooking the beach. And this bloke just turned up in a car. And he had white pants and a white shirt and some sunnies on. And he had a wife and a child in a renter car. I thought, who the hell's this? And I just went up to the front door and said, "G'day, it's Bill McDonough here. How are you? Nice to meet you. Who are you?" And he said, "Oh, it's Neil Young." He said, "I'm just coming to have a look at your comm. Do you mind if I have a look? Because we're going to be doing some recording after you guys." And I said, "No, come on in. Have a look around. We'll show you around." He ended up staying for lunch. Yeah. He was a good bloke.
Yeah, and you had a memorable tour with LRB and Willie Nelson. You got along with that band very well.
Yeah, he was good. Yeah, Willie and I and Guy got on well, and he's a character, a real journeyman. Absolute, nothing fazed him. I won't let too much out of the story of the book, but there was a pretty dramatic incident at one of our concerts in New Zealand, and after the trouble subsided, Willie just continued on with the gig, totally unfazed, as though nothing had happened. I mean, he'd been on the road for centuries. He looked as old as Methuselah then. Guy and I ended up having a spar with he and his sister. He looked like he'd been dragged through the bloody scrub. He looked that old, but gee, he was probably only about 40 then. So he was a good guy. Charlie Daniels' band we played with, of course, all the guys out of LRB, the Knack, they were good guys. Who else did we meet? I've met a couple of the guys from the Eagles. That's all that comes to mind at the moment.
Yeah. You fought pretty hard to release Guy's album My Place and produce the Lost and Found Rarities album independently. You must be very, very proud of those accomplishments.
In retrospect, yes, because I'm finding now that true followers of Crawl and Guy treasure those recordings. I was disappointed because I couldn't get what I really wanted to achieve because Guy was dead and the technology at the time didn't allow us to, do the level of recording that I would have liked. So it was a real sort of patchwork exercise. The My Place record was back pre-digital, and then we're able to take a lot of those tracks off My Place and bring them into the 90s when we did Lost and Found. So it took those recordings up a notch from a technical perspective. And yeah, the Lost and Found record sounds pretty good. But, you know, there was no going back and changing arrangements. We couldn't refine it as a McDonough Brothers record as we'd hoped we would one day do. I was stuck with what I had, and I just had to make silk out of the sow's ear. But I reckon it's come off pretty good. And for me, it's a success because it documents what we were doing behind Australian Crawl with that writing group, the Flatheads, Sean Higgins, me, Guy, the guy called Nigel Spencer. And that was the lineup that we wanted to take into recording after Crawl had finished its career. But it never happened. In fact, all the guys in the Flatheads are dead. Sean died, Nigel died, and of course, Guy died very young. So we were never able to fulfill that dream, unfortunately.
Yeah. So what do you hope people get out of reading this book?
Well, I know what people are getting out of it because I've had phenomenal response. They love the nostalgia of the book. And this is a surprise to me, but my publisher said that this was going to be a very important part of the book. And that was going back to the very beginning about the McDonough boys as little boys growing up in post-war Melbourne in the 50s and describing how we lived in those days. You know, no telephone, no maid roads, no sewer, horse and cart, no car, you know, no internet, none of that stuff. And then following our life through into the 60s, you know, when rock and roll and fashion exploded, and then into the 70s with our early bands, and then into the 80s with the success of Australian Crawl. A lot of that is very nostalgic for a lot of readers because they're going back and they're revisiting their own lives to a certain extent. That was one of the main reasons I wanted to write the book, to tell how the two brothers developed and how the two personalities created a team that eventually was successful in the music industry in Australia. And the other thing I wanted to get across too was, you know, what really went down in Australian Crawl, you know, without writing an Australian Crawl book, but to tell people my journey through Australian Crawl with Guy from my eyes, how I saw it. And because there's just a lot of junk written about people, you know, you become famous and all this crap that was written about Guy and his, you know, so-called problems with addiction, and, you know, he died of AIDS, just absolute rubbish. And, you know, the thing about Crawl too, there's a lot of misreporting about Australian Crawl and how it really lived and breathed. You know, I'm sure a lot of people just think Australian Crawl, James Rain, but there were 5 other guys in that band, singing, writing hit songs, playing, you know, amazing guitar. And I just wanted to make everyone understand the realities of where we went with that group.
Yeah. Sons of Beaches is the name of the book. It's a great read, Bill. There are many layers to it. Any music fan of Australian music should read it. And thanks for your time.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.